Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Jae-myung. Chinese President Xi Jinping has visited South Korea for the first time in 11 years. He sat down with South Korean President Jae-myung on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Gyeongiu. President Xi called for opening up new prospects for bilateral relations. This came after years of tension after Seoul decided to host the U.S. THAAD missile defense system in 2016. He also emphasized the importance of strengthening friendship between the two peoples and bringing their hearts closer together. President Lee said South Korea is willing to strengthen cooperation with China, maintain the stability of the supply chain, and bring more well-being to the people of both countries. Are we witnessing a reset in China-South Korea relations? What is driving this shift, and could South Korea's approach offer a model for other U.S. allies navigating relations with China? For these questions and more, we are joined by Ying, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University, Li Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, Digby James Wren, External Relations Advisor to the Royal Academy of Cambodia, and he is also the chair of BRCP, a geopolitical risk advisory firm. So welcome to you all. And Professor Rong, let me start with you. How significant is President Xi's first visit to South Korea in 11 years? And would you see this as a reset in bilateral ties?
Yeah, thank you again for having me. It was a very significant visit, as very much, I think, reflected by both the remarks or the interviews given by Wang Yi and the foreign minister, and also, I think, from the Korean side about, I think we can understand how important, how significant, or I think how much, how many anticipations, expectations that following the visit, the impact of the relationship as a whole, but most importantly, I think as the outcomes of the visit were being implemented, how significantly it would be, in fact, the overall relationship between China and ROK, and also the region as a whole. I think, having said that, of course, a few highlights. First and foremost, actually rightly said that it has been the strategic partnership for cooperation. That commitment has been reiterated, as we remember that characterization of the relationship was first agreed that in 2008. So that is a very important framework for the relationship. And of course, the practical cooperation, there are some, again, agreements, important agreements signed over 10, not only on the question of the traditional ones, for example, on the question of the trade and investment, but also on some we call emerging sectors related to digital economy and so on and so forth. Last but not least, I think there's also been understanding that institutionally, I mean, in terms of practical cooperation or trade and investment, I think the second so-called the China ROK 2.0 free trade agreement, that would be reviewed, and negotiations would be started. And last but not least, I think, of course, at the regional and global level, there are many understandings that would also, in together, helps the two countries to navigate the uncertainties and changes, transformation that are taking place in the region and the world at large. But the most important, to provide the ground for closer people-to-people interactions, as, again, are very much important for close neighbors, I think, between China and ROK.
Yes. So, Professor Lee, what do you think made now the right moment for China and South Korea to start mending their ties?
Well, thank you for the question. So, I think Professor has elaborated on how this is a very significant moment for both to actually repair their ties. But I also wish to say, why is it now the right moment? It's because I believe, first of all, I think neighbors, I mean, they understand that they're neighbors, and it was never a good idea for neighbors to be hostile towards each other. And at present, I think they share common ground to better their relations, which is the unpredictability of Donald Trump and its nationalist policies. Meaning that I think even, traditional US allies like South Korea, they they weren't sure if Donald Trump and his administration will actually be backing them uh, for whatever happens. For example, there is escalation in the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, I think this is the common ground that China and South Korea actually share, where they think the unpredictability of Donald Trump actually brings a lot of volatility to the global economy, which is harmful for everyone. Yeah. So South Korea at this moment, they needed consistency and stability, and this is something um, this is only something that China can actually provide them, because the relationship with China actually has been quite consistent and stable. But of course, there are certain issues which are unresolved, and their differences unresolved. But generally, actually, China's has a very clear foreign policy towards South Korea, and this is also a good moment for China and South Korea, particularly for South Korea, because there are important issues that China can actually help with, but not the US. So, for example, we look at, South Korea is actually hoping China could help with re-engaging North Korea. So we have seen in recent years an increase in military activities within the Korean demilitarized zone. So this is, something very alarming and insecure for, South Korean people. So this shows that if the ties, re-engagement with North Korea cannot happen without the help of China. So the role of China in this, re-engagement is very important. And I think South Korean, they don't want to see that their relationship with North Korea getting worse over the time, because it can bring a lot of instability to the Korean Peninsula. But again, I want to say that this visit also is quite significant because it coincided with the 10th anniversary of the South Korea-China Free Trade Agreement. So President Xi also said that, they hope that they can actually accelerate the discussions for the phase 2 of this free trade agreement. So with that, if that can be done by including other areas of cooperation like high tech, digital trade, it actually can help to better ties between both countries.
Okay, so Dr. Wren, actually, just now, Professor Lee said that Trump's nationalist policies and the ties with North Korea are like the key factors that somehow push China and South Korea closer together. Anything you want to add?
Well, yes, because under the previous president, who's now in prison, President Yoon, they really stirred up all of the or intensified all of the nationalist and populist sentiments, with sort of false narratives about China. And I think it's very interesting that the new president, Lee Jae-myung, he's really focusing on a much more pragmatic and flexible foreign policy, obviously influenced and driven by the actions of the United States and Donald Trump. And I think that made the depth of the alliance questionable. I don't think the alliance is going to break, but I do believe that they're going to seek more strategic autonomy within the alliance. And this is not new. I mean, the Australians have tried to do the same thing. So I think that's a kind of a trend, actually, and most of that can be blamed on the actions of Donald Trump, of course. But look, there's so much that can be built upon, as the previous speaker just said. Trying to maximize South Korea's national interests means basically, in diplomacy, security, and the economy. And economically, of course, it's been difficult for South Korea over the last, even just a few years, actually, not just the last year, but actually for 2 or 3 years, it's been quite difficult. So the only way to go here is up. with the relationship with China. I think it's all positive momentum, even though there are still some sticking points about things like, I don't know, cultural legacy and so forth. But look, this new neighborhood diplomacy action from China, I think, lines up perfectly with the situation, and so Seoul can can definitely chase its strategic directions more directly with Beijing, and that is all good.
Yeah, and also, Dr. Wren, how would you characterize Li Jae-myung's strategy now? Because he actually said the old formula, U.S. for security, China for economy, is no longer viable. So what do you think? Is he seeking some new balancing act now?
Well, yes, definitely. What he's saying is that, the alliance is not going to break, but what's going to happen is Korea is going to be thinking about its own real interests and its own real geography and its other trade partners much, much more. And, a strategic autonomy within the alliance structure that it has. So yes, Seoul has going to, I think, connect much more into the new economy, new productive forces, if you like, so tech and green and all those sorts of things. There's enormous complementarity between South Korea and China. So I think that is going to be a win-win, definitely, in economic terms for sure, and that's going to spill over into people, tourism, and all those sorts of things. And Korea has got a good model for a lot of that too. Cultural activities and other new productive forces. They're really quite advanced in that, and I think China can learn from Korea in many ways.
Okay, so Dr. Rong, why do you think President Lee would say that the old formula is no longer viable? And do you think it is easy for it to separate its diplomatic strategy from its security alliance with the U.S.?
Well, that's a great question. I think the so-called formula, U.S. for security, China for economy, is kind of possibly, I think, too simplistic way to describe a kind of a complicated dynamic, which is being constantly evolving or shifting in the context where, first and foremost, I think China and the U.S. relationship is also undergoing some dramatic changes. As also I seen in short term, in the wake of the important sort of meeting between President Xi and President Trump, the relationship is now moving towards a kind of a stability while the structural contradictions or problems remain. So in the meantime, I think recognition or the understanding that China's role in the region, in certainly on the peninsula, but also in the region as well, will go much beyond on economic and trade and the field, and has a very important sort of role, or increasingly important role in terms of maintain peace and stability on the peninsula and in the region as a whole. So that formula, or possibly, if we want to look at the changing dynamic, definitely is too old. But what will be the new framework or new formula to describe or to help understanding the new dynamic? That would be something I think certainly have to look at by taking out the changes that are taking place bilaterally, but most importantly, I think the interactions between these major countries. So we have actually not talked about Russia and also a stakeholder, important stakeholder, the DPRK, and how these relationships among them are being sort of evolving.
Okay, and Professor Lee, just now you said that Seoul may want to hedge against its overdependence on Washington, especially given the Trump administration's nationalist policies. Then how do you think Washington might view this thaw between South Korea and China? And would you see it as a potential challenge to U.S. influence in the region?
Well, I think first of all, again, like what both speakers have actually highlighted, increasingly now, the space for South Korea to maneuver between US and China is actually getting narrower. The space to navigate is getting narrower because like what Professor say, it's no longer so simplistic that South Korea can choose, I can cooperate with US for security and China for economy. The reason was because, as we can see, their geopolitical competition between the US and China has escalated not only in security, but also in economy. So that is very difficult for South Korea to actually separate security cooperation with the US from economic cooperation with China. So it's no longer a choice that South Korea can make. So for example, of course, there is a nationalist policies from Trump that makes South Korea very feel very uncertain and unsure whether they will be given the security guarantee that they're supposed to be given. So under this situation, I think what would happen is that South Korea can still cooperate with China, but only on selective issues that are not so sensitive. So, for example, what I would say sensitive, probably cooperation in semiconductor in certain areas, like helping China to access high technology in production, might be quite sensitive. So, because as we know, the US is not keen to have China to develop self-sufficiency in this aspect, and US working with other countries are actually restricting China's access to semiconductor high tech, whether it's the chip making equipment or the high-end chips. So this is something that the US might not be happy if China and South Korea actually work on this area. But again, I think South Korea still needs to balance, needs to navigate, and therefore, rather than talking about cooperation in security with the US and economic cooperation with China, South Korea, its president said we want to take on a new role as a bridge between both powers. So what they want to do is like what DB has actually highlighted. They want to seek strategic autonomy within the alliance, and South Korea wanted to pursue a balanced and independent South Korean foreign policy. So that means is that the new role as a bridge is more like a convening platform for both parties to actually come together to talk, but rather, as a role that can dissolve these strategic tensions between the US and China. So again, this is something like a task for the leadership, South Korean leadership. They really need to reshape its foreign policy when dealing with Trump nationalist policy. And also, their cooperation with China.
Okay, so Professor Rong, where do you think China might stand on these so-called sensitive issues? And President Xi emphasized mutual respect and seeking common ground while shelving differences. What does that mean in practice? And also, we have to remember the THAAD issue hasn't really been resolved, right?
Yeah, that's again a great question. I think the THAAD issues, South Korean are okay, I can say, should have learned good lessons from that episode, which, as you rightly said, has not fully resolved. Rather, some of the sort of issues or deep-rooted issues related to THAAD remains not only as there, still in the future could come back to haunt South Korea. I very much, I think, agree with Professor May remarks about the difficulties, but also I think the need to strike a new balance. Balance by sort of redefine, South Korea to redefine its role as a bridge. And also, I think to do that, to ensure that it would have more or pursue more strategic autonomy. That is actually very much reflected in the thinkings of the new administration, ROK, President Lee Jae-myung, talking about the putting its national interest first and to pursue a pragmatic diplomacy. The question is, of course, it's always, I think, whether ROK, they could, the policymaker, they could, I think, work out. First, I think reach a consensus among themselves. I know there are, people who very much still believe that follow. There are different views. Those who very much focus on the alliance between the two, between ROK and the U.S. There are others who very much advocate a kind of strategic autonomy by putting, by looking for more rooms or for leverages. All in all, I think President Xi's remarks, which reflect very much, I think, the consistent policy of China that we understand and respect the differences between the China and ROK, and of course, as extension and other neighbors, because they are neighbors, that's natural. But the most important thing is that I think keep in mind we have to respect each other's and core interest, show sensitivities, and working together to find a way to for common ground despite these differences. So it is not an easy job, but I think more consultations, more substantial, I think strategic dialogue should be conducted. Most importantly, I think China would, I hope that through ROK, the new government would learn good lessons from the episode of SAD and properly manage new issues arising from the outcome and of the geopolitical rivalries as we have seen.
Dr. Wren, is it possible for Seoul to become an intermediary or bridge between China and the U.S.?
Yes, I definitely agree with you on that they can be a bridge, as Professor May and Professor Yong have both said. This is going to have to be the case, I think. And so they've had to, what this strategic autonomy means is they're bifurcating. So they're splitting the security and the economic, which is exactly the opposite of what the Americans have done. You see, what Trump's done is he's put those together. He's made one pillar out of economy and security. And they act, everything that's economic, every action is a national security action. The tariffs, questionable tariffs, because the Supreme Court in the United States may yet say that they're not legal, although I have my doubts about that. But yes, I think Korea is in a strong position to do that. And this is driven in many ways because what the US is doing is it's also injuring the economies of its allies. It's in many ways cannibalizing its allies' economies by demanding huge amounts of investment, by putting on the tariffs, by lowering imports and all these sorts of things. And so it's in Korea's interest, in its real interest, to become that bridge. And it's always been, I suppose, some kind of a bridge in some way. But, over the last few years under President Yoon, that was the bridge was closed in real terms. And Yoon was, in Washington singing American Pie. And so that's come to an end. And I think, the first thing, as Professor Yong said, we need to see strategic communication that can solidify this opening of the bridge, so to speak, and thinking, a joint basis for building a real future that's not going to be buffeted by Donald Trump and possibly his successors.
Thank you. We've been talking to Digby James Wren, External Relations Advisor to the Royal Academy of Cambodia, and he is also the chair of BRCP, a geopolitical risk advisory firm. Rong Ying, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University, and Lee Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. And we remind our listeners, if you want to hear this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, just download our podcast by searching World Today. And for further discussion, you can follow us on X at CGTN Radio. Let's take a short break here. Coming back, we'll continue our discussion. Please stay tuned. Welcome back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ying, joined by Rong, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University, Li Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, Digby James Wren, External Relations Advisor to the Royal Academy of Cambodia, and he's also the chair of BRCP, a geopolitical risk advisory firm. Professor Li, we've been discussing these high-level exchanges, but as we know, negative public perceptions still persist on both sides. So how much impact can the summit diplomacy really have in terms of changing the hearts and minds at the grassroots level?
Well, I personally feel that it's quite difficult to shift public sentiment. Well, I mean, meaning that it's shaped over time. It cannot be changed just so easily. So it will take time and efforts to shift the sentiment. Actually, on both sides, I think the public sentiment is not so great on both sides, that both were viewing each other negatively. I mean, the people on both sides. So what it actually means is that probably the recent diplomatic tour between South Korea and China is driven far more by strategic calculation among the political elites. So it doesn't mean that this diplomatic tour is driven by improvement in public sentiment. But having said that, I think changing public sentiment in South Korea and China will take more time and resources. So, for example, the media, policymakers, in the past, like in South Korea, they have been, shaping the negative opinion about China because of what has been displayed on media, what has been, what are the policies taken by the policymakers that actually they shape this narrative, anti-China narrative. But again, this can be shaped, but not so easily. First of all, of course, elite level engagement as a start is very good because it helps to stabilize relations and also reduce crises. But to reshape these grassroots perceptions, you need to have like sustained cultural, educational, economic exchanges. So, for example, we talk about people-to-people exchanges that can be boosted, educational exchanges, for example, university students exchanges, scholars exchanges, economic exchanges, of course, like what we say, this China-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. Could that be actually the phase 2 discussion can it be accelerated and can it be finalized as soon as possible? And this all will then affect this public sentiment. I will say like now is a very, very good first step where these political elites, they want to engage with each other and talking about, like what earlier speaker says, President Xi says, yeah, there is differences, but we shall shove it. It's a very pragmatic approach because I think differences between countries, like cultural, historical, exist. No, not only between China and South Korea, even between between Southeast Asian countries, there are differences. Yeah. So it's important that they don't focus on the differences so much, but instead they focus on which are the areas that can actually make a meaningful improvement in their relationship. And this, I think, would help, persistent efforts, from the elite level media, policymakers could actually later on help to change the hearts and minds of the public.
Okay, so Professor Rong, as Professor Li said, cultural exchanges can play an important role. And after years of limited cultural collaboration, do you think we are entering a new phase of normalization in cultural relations between China and South Korea? And what might that mean for artists and audiences in both countries going forward?
Well, definitely, I think we are having a more sort of a better environment in which the cultural exchanges, I mean, these programs, people interactions are going to have a different, first and foremost, atmosphere. But most importantly, I think give us, the average people, the people on the street, new exposures about what has taken place or happening in each other. I mean, societal levels. I try to recall, I think, what happened. I mean, that people interactions or the sentiments has been turned sort of bad. It very much, I think, because of the political relationship, but then also I think the question of when people getting know each other more, it tend to I think see or a better understanding about the differences, which not necessarily helps have a good sort of feelings against each other. Uh, but the sort of improving our relationship, as have demonstrated by the two leadership, definitely first and foremost, it provides a political sort of framework, and but at a practical level, a lot of sort of restrictions or sort of hesitations would also, I mean, lifted. So I'm not expecting that the cooperation or exchanges in this area will come back as it was 20 years ago, where a lot of K-pops and also I think I'm trying to call the Korean TV serials that was long at one time. I'm trying to recall the number. I mean the name to call the
Hallyu, Hallyu.
Liu, yeah, Da Jung Gun. It's a long TV
Mm-hmm.
series. I mean, talk about imperial physician, a lady. I think she's so popular. I mean,
Yes.
right. Anyway, we are going to have, because it's been, well, living in a different time, and so the focus or the future should be the younger generations, and more importantly, I think explore new sort of a way for communications. For example, in TV, I mean, excuse me, in sports areas, Chinese and Koreans are competitors, competing almost every field. But more and more, you will find there are some stories for, despite that the competition, I mean, sportsmen, I mean, these players are getting friends, you know. So these are the stories, again, are very much important. And so we have now, I think, opened up a new sort of, have a new environment, new atmosphere. Hopefully, and that is why I guess the reason one of the sort of priority areas, the two leadership put on renewed efforts for interaction, people to people and cultural exchange. We'll
Yes.
see.
Yes, yes. And also, Dr. Wren, how do you think both governments can really translate this high-level momentum into some deeper people-to-people understanding? And on the other hand, might the nationalistic sentiment in both countries kind of limit how far the leaders can actually go in rebuilding trust? Like, how might public opinion constrain President Lee Jae-myung's diplomatic flexibility?
Well, I mean, they're starting from a low point in Korea in real terms, but I think that actually there's a very deep well of appreciation for each country's, for China and Korea's shared cultural history and interaction over thousands of years. And you know, we need to tap into that well of collective memory, and I think it's not so deep actually, and it can be accelerated or promoted and gain more momentum fairly quickly. I know that you know, I've spoken to many young Koreans, and they're very interested in what China's doing. They see lots of new things that they can experience in China culturally, educationally, sports, entertainment, media, communications, all of those things. But then culture is a very, very wide field. I mean, it goes into fashion and beauty and all of those things. And Korea has been very, very good at organizing itself to export its own cultural depth and capabilities. K-pop is an obvious one, and Hallyu is another, as Professor Young just talked about. But there's much more than that, I think, and this can work fairly quickly, I think, and there's also economic momentum for that as well. And I don't believe that. Well, I believe that Professor Young is right. That the future, of course, is the young people, and that's the focus that we should mostly have. Although saying that, I also believe that the silver economy, aging population, more older people, especially in Korea, but also in China, there's a enormous opportunity there for tourism. I think we've already seen a spike in Korean tourists in China already. And I think that's going to continue. And so there's a lot of potential there. And I believe that because Korea introduced their policy for people exchanges and their cultural policies as a sort of a national effort, that China could actually learn something from that. And Korea wasn't really trying to export its culture per se in terms of traditional culture. It really was promoting youth culture and younger culture, and it's been very, very successful. And I think that can be a great lesson for China. I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity there, and in areas where Korea has become very, very strong in beauty, in health, cosmetics, and all sorts of things like that. China can learn a lot about how to do that, and so getting these people-to-people exchanges accelerated means opening up places in universities immediately. Visa-free entry has already happened, and other steps in these directions. So I see a big future for that, and it can happen fairly quickly. I mean, really, in one election cycle, in 3 to 4 years, we can see an enormous change. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yes. And Dr. Lee, on the economic and trade level, President Xi called for accelerating talks on the second phase of the China-South Korea FTA and exploring AI, biopharmaceuticals, green industries, and also what Digby just said, silver economy. So what does each side stand to gain from this partnership?
So I think like what Dr. Wren has explained, I think silver economy holds a great potential because both sides has aging population. And, instead of looking at these old people as a burden, but we can treat them as like an active consumer, and they can actually, their spending can actually stimulate the economy. And this is where I think there is a great potential for cooperation between China and South Korea. But when we talk about, I think why is that important that they accelerate talks on this second phase of the free trade agreement is because the current situation is that the narrative is that a lot of people have been talking about deglobalization and self-sufficiency and, countries turning inward. But again, economic history has proven that if countries actually turn inward and countries tend to like delink with one another, it's not beneficial. The global economy actually shrink as a result of this isolation. So what I think is that now it's really the right time to actually strengthen cooperation in different areas, like all these new areas where it's not covered in the first phase of the China-South Korea FTA. So if they can actually deepen their cooperation in more areas, then it also, this kind of economic interdependence would help them to build trust, to build mutual understanding. Yeah. So I would say that from what China could gain from this partnership, of course, for China, there like we say, there are things like in semiconductors where they can learn from South Korea. In memory chips production, South Korea is very strong in that. So that's where China can actually learn. And of course, what's important if, South Korea and China actually strengthen cooperation in the economy, it can actually help China to avoid being cut off from the key supply chain. I think this effort to cut China out of the key supply chain is driven by the US. But if, for example, China is able to deepen cooperation with South Korea due to the upgrade of this free trade agreement, which means that it's not so easily to just leave China out of key supply chains. Like key supply chain AI, key supply chain in green industries and silver economy. Like all these are very important. Especially AI, we're talking about these are our future, right? So for South Korea, I think, of course, they can gain for most is market access. So China, of course, they has a huge consumer market, which is very beneficial for South Korean firms, especially for biopharma. And of course, South Korea, they produce a lot of cosmetics, medical devices. All this will be very beneficial for South Korean firms. So this kind of export opportunities is something that I think South Korea would want, their firms would want that, considering like what Dr. Wren has explained just now. South Korean economy has not been doing great in this 1-2 years. So in that sense, I would say that both stands to gain from this partnership. So, and I hope that at this critical moment, they really could accelerate talks on on upgrading of this China-South Korea FTA. It's not only here. I think in Southeast Asia, recently Malaysia, we hosted this ASEAN summit, and where ASEAN as a regional bloc, we also upgraded our free trade area with China. So it's a China ASEAN free trade area, and also between ASEAN members. So we have this upgrading of ATIGA is a framework where the purpose is to strengthen intra-trade between Southeast Asian countries, because they knew that the current situation where there are some countries that trying to impose tariff which are not beneficial for trade, they have to do something to counter that. So they are talking about upgrading the FTA and things like that.
Well, Professor Rong, as we know that both China and South Korea has been pushing this green and digital transition, so could the growing competition in semiconductors and EVs become a new fault line in their relationship?
Well, definitely, I think we both China and UK are aware about the sort of emerging or challenges arising from that kind of competition. But again, I would refer to the previous, Professor May's remarks that the two countries would have to look at the overall, the bigger picture, and so that the trade and the investment, that they have a new thinkings or new ways, new approach to manage that competition, and also keep in mind the third sort of country or third country factors. I mean the disruption or interaction around that. That is why I think it's significant that at the meeting, the summit meeting, the visit, during the visit, the two leaders or the two sides pledged that they would accelerate the process. I'm trying to recall the first phase of the free trade agreement, which I think started, it took just 1 year and a half to conclude that negotiations. It launched in 2012, May 2012, and then concluded, by end of, 1 year and a half. And also, of course, it was announced that, the agreement was announced at the Beijing APEC summit. So there are a lot of significance and symbolism related to that, given the fact that both China and UK are advocate for free trade and trade liberalization and so on. So even though I think we have now new challenges and so on and so forth, let us hope. And I think the two sides, as they are negotiate their or upgrade their free trade agreement, they would also keeping in mind the development at the regional levels, as again the two previous speakers and all mentioned about RCEPs, about the other regional sort of trade sort of agreement, and also emerging areas, emerging sectors on digital trade, green development, and so on and so forth. So it is more a kind of thinking where to balance, I think, to the immediate concerns, which I think can be addressed through through talks based on mutual understanding and equality. But in the meantime, the longer term benefits and the trend where both China and ROK would feel that serve their interest if the momentum free trade, regional trade, or free trade in the region APEC would be continued vis-a-vis the other trend or other sort of development with the tariff wars by the United States, Trump administration and so on and so on.
Okay, well, Dr. Wren, I think we discussed earlier South Korea's desire to re-engage with the North. So do you think the improved China-South Korea relations can open a diplomatic pathway toward inter-Korean dialogue?
Well, that would be a very good outcome, wouldn't it? Because the fact that North Korea is economically in many ways isolated is holding back all of Northeast Asia. I know that the extending the Pan-Asian or Eurasian rail networks into South Korea is back on the table, and I think that's a very, very good idea. And that rail network would theoretically have to also pass by North Korea, and I think that's an opportunity. Why can't North Korea be invited to participate as an observer, at least, into these regional frameworks, economic frameworks? No, next year we've got APEC, of course. There's the opportunity with RCEP to establish the secretariat for the RCEP. That has not been done. I think that's something that South Korea and China can work on, and North Korea needs to be, I think, invited into these kind of things. It's already making some economic advances. North Korea is not like it was before. It is improving, and it can go a lot further. And so, yes, the answer is yes. Of course, the US is not going to like that, but it's what you might call, discordant noise, what the Americans are doing. They absolutely don't want that to happen. Well, Trump wanted to speak, and he made a lot of noise about trying to speak with Kim Jong-un, but obviously that didn't work out. So there's definitely an intention, I think, on all parties in the region to get closer with North Korea to see what can be done. And this may provide a small opportunity. It's definitely true that the new president of Korea, Lee, is softer, if you like. And so there's potential there to reopen the, they used to have a sort of a shared manufacturing zone, which was destroyed, during the Yoon or just before Yoon. I think that's something that might be started again. And then again, for China, of course, there's also access, and even for Russia, I think also. Whether the Japanese will be interested in that is another question that could be difficult. But yes, the short answer is yes, there is opportunity there. It will take a lot of work. I think that'll have to be done very quietly. I don't think that can be sort of done in a loud way. That's got to be done very quietly and steadily. But I think that is possible, definitely.
Okay, so Professor Rong, what role do you think China can really play on the Korean Peninsula issue?
Well, again, I think China has always been advocating and indeed play a very important role in terms of bringing peace and stability and prosperity on the peninsula. For to do that, of course, if you look at the past 20 years and more of China's diplomacy, very creative, proactive, and of course also suffered some setbacks in terms of because of the denuclearization, mostly because of, I think, the shifts or the changes of U.S. policy towards towards North Korea and the region as a whole. And I'm trying to be sort of more optimistic, echoing, what my colleagues, good friend, has talked about the opportunities that arising from what we're talking about in terms of regional economic cooperation and integration, or this framework, which I think would not be possible or sustainable without some certain forms of engagement with DPRK, even though I think that expectation or that thinking has been there for many years, but then also a lot of setbacks. We may have to really think about, the impact of the meeting certainly, and China and the ROK. But in the meantime, we have also, we don't have time, but for this session, for this dialogue, but about what is happening in Pyongyang and in northern part of the peninsula in terms of their economic policies or economic sort of thinkings arising from the changes or the transformation that we are talking about. That would possibly give us some new thinking or new hope that it may possible, even though in a different way.
Well, Professor Lee, one last question. If this stall of China-South Korea relations succeeds, could it become a template for how other U.S. allies or other middle powers manage their relations with China in an era of great power competition?
Well, I think if it is successful, it can definitely offer some very useful lessons for other U.S. allies. But I don't think it can be like a strict template because a rigid one, because the dynamics between countries are very different. Mm-hmm. I think they can offer some valuable lessons, but not a rigid template. And first of all, at this point, as we are discussing the relations between South Korea and China, we weren't even sure if the talk would be successful. This is because, not because of China, not because of South Korea, but because of the U.S. If you have look at the U.S., they have been increasingly pressuring countries to actually align with it. For example, I find it quite weird that on one hand, the U.S. are having like trade discussions with China. Trump was saying that, they had a great deal and things like that. And then they're going to lower tariff. And then China is going to buy a lot of agricultural product from the U.S. But on the other hand, you see there are other U.S. agencies that actually went to Southeast Asia and they talked to the leaders about, the importance of increasing their military expenditure to counter China. So I find that there is a bit of inconsistency in what the U.S. is doing, and this would actually affect the relations with China and South Korea. So it could be useful overall if it's successful, but again, at present, we're unsure if it will be successful enough.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lee Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Rong Ying, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University, and Digby James Wren, External Relations Advisor to the Royal Academy of Cambodia, and he is also the chair of BRCP, a geopolitical risk advisory firm. And that's all the time we have for this edition of World Today. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.